The autumn wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the West Virginia hills, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of wood smoke and something older, something rotten beneath the earth. In the shadow of the Alleghenies, where the towns clung like burrs to the rugged terrain, folks in Milford kept their doors bolted after sundown and spoke little of the strangers who vanished along the winding roads. It was 1901, a year when progress hummed in the cities far away, but here, time seemed to curdle, thick and unyielding, like cream left too long in the churn. Elias Hawthorne, a reporter from Charleston with ink-stained fingers and a notebook full of half-forgotten leads, had come chasing rumors. Men, loggers, drifters, the kind who wandered in search of work and never wandered out, had been disappearing for months. 37 of them, if the whispers in the taverns were true. No bodies, no traces, just empty beds in boarding houses and unpaid tabs at the general store. The sheriff dismissed it as the whims of wanderers, but Elias sensed the fear that lurked behind the forced smiles, the way eyes darted to the dense woods beyond the fields. He'd arrived on a drizzling afternoon, the sky a bruised grey that pressed down like a lid on a simmering pot. The innkeeper, a wiry man named Harlan with a face carved from hickory, handed him a key and muttered about staying clear of the old Pike place. "Sisters out there," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "Eleanor and Maud. Ain't right, what they do. Voices in the dark, folks say. Best not to listen." That night, as rain pattered against the windowpane like impatient fingers, Elias lay awake, the oil lamp flickering shadows across the walls. The woods called to him, not with words, but with a pull in his gut, a nagging itch that no amount of whiskey could scratch. By morning, fortified with black coffee and resolve, he set out on foot, following a overgrown trail that twisted deeper into the forest. The trees closed in, their trunks gnarled and watchful, leaves crunching underfoot like brittle bones. Hours blurred into a haze of mist and mud, until the path opened to a clearing, or what might have been one, long ago. There, half swallowed by vines and decay, stood a barn. Not the sturdy kind for hay and horses, but something squat and foreboding, its weathered boards sagging under the weight of secrets. No smoke rose from the nearby cabin, but Elias felt eyes on him, prickling the back of his neck. And then, from within the barn, a sound, low, muffled, like a chorus of men murmuring in their sleep. Or pleading. He approached, heart thudding in his chest, the air growing thick with the stench of sweat and despair. Through a knothole in the door, he glimpsed movement, chains glinting in the gloom, figures hunched and broken. 37 of them, bound like animals in stalls, their faces pale masks of torment. What madness had birthed this? And as the door creaked open on its own, a silhouette emerged from the shadows, a woman, tall and gaunt, her smile a sliver of moonlight in the dark. "Welcome, stranger," she said, her voice smooth as river stones. "We've been expecting you." In the fading light of an October afternoon in 1901, Elias Hawthorne stepped off the rattling train at the small, soot-streaked depot in Milford, West Virginia. The air was sharp with the bite of coming frost, laced with the heavy scent of coal dust and wet leaves that clung to everything like a second skin. Charleston, with its bustling streets and electric lights, felt a world away. Here, the mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their slopes thick with hemlock and oak that swallowed sound and sunlight alike. Elias pulled his wool coat tighter, his valise heavy with notebooks, pencils, and a Kodak camera he hoped would capture proof of whatever darkness had drawn him to this forgotten corner of the state. He was 28, ambitious, and restless, the kind of young reporter who chased stories the bigger papers dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. For weeks, fragments of rumor had reached him through letters slipped under his office door and hushed conversations in Charleston saloons, men vanishing along the back roads of the Alleghenies. Not one or two, but dozens, 37, by the latest count. Itinerant workers mostly, loggers and railroad hands who drifted into the region chasing seasonal labor in the timber camps and coal mines. They arrived with calloused hands and empty pockets, took rooms in boarding houses, drank rye whiskey in dimly lit taverns, and then, without warning or trace, were simply gone. No cries for help, no abandoned belongings left behind to tell their stories. Just silence. The local authorities called it the natural restlessness of transient men, quick to move on when better wages beckoned elsewhere. But Elias had seen the pattern in the telegraphed reports and handwritten pleas from anxious families, The disappearances clustered around Milford and the dense hollows beyond, always in the shadow of the same impenetrable woods. Something about the numbers gnawed at him. 37 was too precise to be coincidence, too deliberate to be chance. And beneath the official indifference, he sensed fear, the kind that made grown men lower their voices and glance over their shoulders when the subject arose. As he walked the muddy main street toward the town's lone inn, Elias noted how the residents watched him, a stranger in a pressed suit carrying city manners. Conversations hushed as he passed, doors closed a fraction too quickly. The mountains pressed close, their ridges cutting off the horizon, and in that confinement, secrets seemed to thrive. Whatever had taken those men was still out there, patient and hungry, waiting in the folds of the forest. Elias felt the weight of it settle over him like the gathering dusk, a certainty that he had come to the right place, and that the story he sought might cost more than ink and paper to uncover. The whispers had led him here, and now, standing on the threshold of Milford, he could almost hear them carried on the wind, faint, desperate, calling from somewhere deep within the trees. The morning mist still clung to the hollows when Elias Hawthorne set out from the inn, his boots sinking into the soft earth of Milford's only thoroughfare. He carried a fresh notebook and a polite determination to ask questions that, he already suspected, no one wished to answer. The town was small enough that every face felt familiar by the second day, yet strangers like him were treated with the wary courtesy reserved for revenue agents or traveling preachers. Doors opened just wide enough for conversation, never wide enough for invitation. His first stop was the general store, a low building with a sagging porch and shelves heavy with coffee, calico, and coal oil. The proprietor, a thick-set woman named Mrs. Greathouse, weighed out nails for a farmer while glancing at Elias from the corner of her eye. When the farmer left, she turned to him with a tight smile. "City paper, are you? Come about the missing men, I reckon." Elias nodded, keeping his voice mild. "Folks say 37 have gone. That seem right to you?" She busied herself rearranging tins of peaches, her knuckles whitening on the cans. "Men come and go. Always have. Mountains take what they want." He tried the blacksmith next, a soot-streaked giant who hammered a plowshare into shape with rhythmic blows that echoed like gunshots. When Elias mentioned disappearances, the man paused mid-swing, sweat glistening on his brow. "Best leave that alone, mister. Some things ain't meant for ink." His gaze flicked toward the tree line beyond the forge, where the forest pressed against the clearing like a living wall. Elias followed the look but saw only shadows among the trunks. By midday he had worked his way through the saloon, the post office, and the cluster of houses along the creek. The answers were always the same, polite deflections wrapped in mountain reticence. Eyes averted, voices lowered, shoulders hunched as if against a sudden chill. Yet beneath the evasion ran a current of unease so palpable Elias could almost taste it, metallic and sharp, like blood on the tongue. It was late afternoon when he reached the mill, a rambling structure perched where the creek tumbled over rocks. The miller, an older man with a face like split oak, leaned against the doorway wiping flour from his hands. Elias asked his question one more time. The miller studied him for a long moment, then spoke so softly Elias had to step closer to hear. "Pike Sisters," he muttered, the name barely louder than the water's rush. "Eleanor and Maud. Live back in the woods, past the old quarry road. Folks don't go near." When Elias pressed for more, the man's expression shuttered. He turned away, busying himself with sacks of grain, but not before Elias caught the flicker of something raw in his eyes, fear, or perhaps recognition of a shared dread. As Elias walked back toward the inn, the sun sinking behind the ridges, he noticed how conversations hushed when he passed. No one met his gaze for long. The name Pike hung in the air like smoke, unspoken now but no less present. Somewhere beyond the fields, deep where the trees grew thick and ancient, two women lived apart from the world, and the town had learned, over years of silence, exactly how high a price curiosity could demand. The third morning broke cold and sullen, a low ceiling of clouds pressing the mist into the valleys until the world felt half submerged. Elias Hawthorne left the inn before the town stirred, a flask of coffee in his coat pocket and the borrowed Colt revolver heavy against his ribs. He told himself it was only precaution, the way a man might carry an umbrella against a clear sky, but the weight reassured him all the same. The trail began as a rutted wagon track behind the mill, then narrowed to a footpath choked with laurel and rhododendron, the branches slick with damp that soaked through his sleeves within minutes. He walked for hours, the forest growing denser with every mile, sunlight filtered to a greenish murk that made time uncertain. The ground rose and fell in deceptive swells, hiding hollows where water stood black and still. Birds called overhead, but their voices seemed distant, muffled by the thick canopy, as though the trees themselves swallowed sound. Elias marked his way with notches on bark and scraps of torn newsprint wedged into forks of branches, though he suspected the woods might shift them when his back was turned. By late afternoon the path all but vanished, forcing him to push through walls of undergrowth that clawed at his trousers and left thin lines of blood on his knuckles. The air grew heavier, laced with the sweet rot of fallen leaves and something sharper beneath iron, perhaps, or old sweat. He paused to drink from the flask, the coffee gone cold and bitter, and listened. Nothing but the drip of moisture from leaves and the faint rustle of unseen creatures. Then, carried on a breath of wind that stirred the mist, came the sound, low, intermittent, almost human. A moan, or a word stretched beyond recognition, rising and falling like a distant train whistle lost in the hills. Elias froze, pulse hammering in his throat. The cry came again, fainter this time, seeming to slide along the ground rather than through the air. It pulled at him, not with clarity but with insistence, threading through the trees from some direction he could not name. He turned slowly, trying to fix its source, but the forest played tricks. The sound circled, now ahead, now behind, now beneath his feet. Compelled despite the prickling dread that crawled up his spine, he moved toward it, parting branches that closed behind him like curtains. The ground sloped downward into a narrow ravine he had not noticed before, the sides steep and overgrown with vines thick as pythons. At its bottom lay a faint trace, an old corduroy road of half-rotted logs, barely visible under decades of leaf mold. The cries grew clearer here, threaded with others, a chorus too low for words yet unmistakably anguished. Elias followed the sunken track as dusk began to pool in the hollows, the mist thickening until the trees loomed like pale ghosts on either side. Each step carried him deeper, the voices drawing him onward, promising revelation even as every instinct screamed to turn back. The overgrown path twisted once more, descending into shadow, and Elias pressed on, the cries now constant, a wretched murmur that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ravine bottomed out into a small, bowl-shaped clearing where the mist hung thick and unmoving, as though the air itself had forgotten how to rise. Elias Hawthorne paused at the edge, his breath coming in shallow puffs that vanished quickly into the damp. Before him stood the barn, not the proud, red-painted structure of prosperous farms, but a low, hunched thing built from rough-hewn logs gone silver with age and neglect. Vines had claimed its sides in thick ropes, pulling at the boards until gaps showed like wounds. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles curled and missing, and from the eaves hung long beards of grey moss that swayed though there was no wind. No windows pierced the walls facing him, only a single wide door banded with rusted iron, hanging slightly ajar on leather hinges gone stiff and cracked. The clearing around it had once been grazed or ploughed, perhaps, but now briars and young saplings crowded close, erasing any memory of cultivation. A faint path, little more than trampled weeds, led from the tree line to the door, suggesting passage, yet the growth looked fresh, as if the earth resented the intrusion and hurried to heal the scar. Elias moved forward slowly, boots silent on the sodden ground. The voices he had followed were louder here, no longer carried on the wind but seeping through the very planks, a low, continuous murmur threaded with occasional sharper notes, grunts, coughs, the metallic clink of links. The smell struck him fully now, animal confinement mingled with human despair, sharp urine and old sweat baked into wood over years. He circled to the side, keeping to the deeper shadows, until he found a knothole large enough to press his eye against. Inside, the gloom was broken only by thin blades of light slipping through cracks overhead. Dust floated in those beams like slow ash. Along both walls ran rows of stalls meant for livestock, but the gates had been reinforced with iron bars and padlocks newer than the building itself. In each stall, shapes huddled, men, gaunt and filthy, their clothing reduced to rags that barely preserved decency. Chains ran from iron rings bolted to the floor beams, allowing limited movement but no escape. Some sat with heads bowed, others paced the short length of their tethers, the links rasping softly. Faces turned toward faint sounds, eyes reflecting the dim light like those of cornered creatures. 37, Elias thought, counting instinctively, though the shadows made precision difficult. Their beards were long, hair matted, skin pale and marred with sores where iron had bitten deep. A few noticed the faint disturbance at the knothole. One man near the front lifted his head, staring directly at the peephole with an expression Elias could not read: hope, warning, or simple exhaustion. The murmuring rose for a moment, a ripple through the stalls, then subsided as if by unspoken agreement. Elias drew back, heart pounding against his ribs, the Colt's grip slick in his palm. The barn breathed around him, alive with captivity, and in that moment he understood the true scale of the horror the town had chosen to ignore. The door behind him creaked wider on its own, a slow invitation into the dark. Elias had scarcely withdrawn from the knothole when the barn door swung inward with a deliberate groan, the sound deliberate, almost courteous, as though the building itself had chosen to admit him. The mist spilled inside like milk poured into dark tea, and from the deeper shadows beyond the stalls a figure detached itself and stepped into the faint light. She was tall, angular, dressed in a faded black dress that might once have been Sunday best but now hung loose on a frame sharpened by years and solitude. Her hair, iron gray and pulled into a severe knot, framed a face pale as tallow, the skin drawn tight over prominent bones. Her eyes, however, held a steady, unblinking clarity that fixed on Elias with neither surprise nor alarm, only a quiet assessment, as if she had watched his approach from the moment he entered the clearing. "You've come a long way through the wet," she said, her voice low and even, carrying the soft drawl of the hills but stripped of warmth. "Eleanor Pike. My sister's inside tending supper. You'll take a bowl with us, won't you? A man gets hollow walking these woods." The invitation was delivered with the calm politeness of a hostess greeting an expected guest, yet the chained men behind her shifted restlessly, chains scraping softly against the packed earth floor. One or two lifted their heads, eyes wide and pleading, but none dared speak. Elias's hand brushed the revolver beneath his coat, more reflex than intention, but the woman's gaze flicked to the movement and returned to his face without comment. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door with a thin hand that bore faint scars across the knuckles, old burns, perhaps, or the marks of rope. "No need for iron out here," she murmured, as though reading the thought. "The woods keep their own." Beyond the barn, half hidden by a stand of elderberry and sumac, stood a small cabin built of the same weathered logs, its chimney exhaling a thin ribbon of smoke that mingled with the mist. The path between barn and house was worn bare, trodden smooth by years of passage, and Elias noticed how the weeds had been carefully bent away from it, as if even the wild growth respected the sisters' domain. Eleanor turned and began walking toward the cabin, her stride unhurried, expecting obedience. Against every instinct that screamed for retreat, Elias followed, drawn by the need to understand how such abomination could persist unnoticed, and by the unsettling certainty in her manner that suggested refusal might prove more dangerous than acceptance. As they neared the cabin door, it opened from within, revealing a second woman, shorter, stockier, but bearing the same sharp features and watchful eyes. "Maud," he presumed. She wiped her hands on a stained apron and studied him with the same measured calm. "Brought company, have you?" she asked her sister, a faint curve touching her lips that might have been amusement. "Set another place, then. We've plenty." Elias crossed the threshold, the scent of stewed rabbit and wood smoke enveloping him, and felt the door close softly at his back. The latch clicked with quiet finality. In the dim interior, lit only by a single lamp and the glow from the hearth, the sisters moved with practiced ease, setting a chipped bowl and spoon before him as though strangers at their table were commonplace. Yet their eyes never left him, bright and knowing, and Elias understood, with a chill that settled deep in his bones, that the hospitality offered was merely the first thread in a web already spinning. The cabin's single room felt smaller than its walls allowed, the air thick with the steam of rabbit stew and the faint, underlying tang of lye soap and something medicinal, herbs dried too long, perhaps, or liniments brewed from roots Elias could not name. A rough-hewn table stood beneath the lamp, its surface scarred by decades of knives and hot pots, and upon it the sisters placed the bowl before him with deliberate care. Maud ladled thick portions, her movements precise, while Eleanor pulled a bench for him to sit. The hearth crackled softly, throwing shadows that danced across shelves lined with jars of preserved fruits, bundles of dried plants, and yellowed photographs in crooked frames, faces of women with the same sharp bones, staring out from tintypes long faded. Elias ate sparingly, the meat tender but flavored with unfamiliar bitterness, his eyes roaming the room for clues. On a hook near the door hung a man's coat, patched and oversized, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. Beside the fireplace rested a ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages swollen with use. When Maud turned to stir the pot, he caught sight of a smaller door at the back, leading perhaps to a sleeping loft or storeroom, secured by a heavy iron hasp that gleamed newer than anything else in the cabin. Conversation began innocently enough, queries about the weather in Charleston, the state of the railroads, the price of timber, but the sisters' questions circled gradually inward, probing his reasons for wandering the woods alone, his lack of wife or kin waiting back home. Their voices overlapped in quiet harmony, finishing one another's sentences with the ease of lifelong companionship, yet each word carried an undercurrent of appraisal, as though weighing his suitability against some private scale. At length, Eleanor rose to clear the bowls, and in passing the ledger she let it fall open briefly on the table. Elias glimpsed columns of dates stretching back years, names scrawled in faded ink beside notations of height, build, coloration of hair and eyes, catalogues such as stockmen kept for breeding livestock. His stomach tightened. Maud noticed his glance and smiled thinly. "Family records," she said. "We've always been particular about bloodlines. Mountain folk die out easy if we're not careful." The implication settled over him like the cabin's low ceiling. From the barn came a faint renewal of the murmuring, carried through the walls on the evening chill, and Elias understood then the full scope of the abomination. A deliberate, methodical captivity spanning generations, men selected and taken not for labor or ransom but for enforced propagation, their offspring raised in isolation to replenish a lineage the sisters believed tainted or endangered. Children born of chains, hidden from the world, taught only what served the Pike purpose. The photographs on the shelf suddenly resolved into clearer meaning, generations of women bearing the same gaunt features, eyes bright with the same unyielding certainty. Eleanor returned to her seat, folding her hands. "You're strong," she observed quietly. "Good stock. The woods brought you for a reason." Maud nodded, reaching for a length of rope coiled beneath the bench, and Elias felt the cabin tilt, the lamplight narrowing to pinpoints as the true nature of their hospitality revealed itself in the calm, inevitable patience of predators who had waited years between meals. The chair scraped backward as Elias surged to his feet, the revolver clearing his coat in a single motion, its barrel leveled at Eleanor's chest. The sisters did not flinch. Maud's hand tightened on the rope, but she held it low, almost casual, while Eleanor tilted her head as though listening to something just beyond the cabin walls. The lamplight caught the sheen of satisfaction in their eyes, the quiet triumph of hunters who had cornered game exactly where they intended. "You'll not need that," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying the same measured calm it had held since his arrival. "The woods won't allow harm to come to us. They never have." Maud stepped sideways, placing herself between Elias and the door, her bulk filling the narrow space. From the barn the murmuring rose into a sudden, desperate clamor, chains rattling, voices lifting in hoarse pleas that vibrated through the timbers like a warning bell. Elias's finger whitened on the trigger. "Step aside. I'm leaving, and those men are coming with me." The words sounded steady in his own ears, but the cabin seemed to contract around him, the ceiling lowering, the shadows thickening until the lamp's circle of light felt fragile, besieged. Eleanor smiled then, a slow unveiling of teeth too even for her age. "Leaving," she echoed. "No one leaves the hollow once the trees have chosen. You were marked the moment you heard the voices, Mr. Hawthorne. Strong blood, clear eyes. We've waited 3 seasons for one like you." Maud moved first, swift despite her size, flinging the coiled rope like a whip toward his gun hand. Elias fired, the report deafening in the confined space. Splintering would near the hearth, but the bullet went wide as the rope looped his wrist, jerking him off balance. He twisted, bringing the revolver to bear again, but Eleanor was already there, impossibly quick, her thin fingers closing around his throat with a strength that belied her gaunt frame. Her nails dug in, not breaking skin but pinning him with cold precision. As they forced him toward the back door, Elias caught fragments of their murmured exchange, words in a cadence older than English, syllables that seemed to stir the very air. The hasp snapped open, revealing stone steps descending into a root cellar lit by a single tallow candle. Jars lined the walls, dark liquids preserving things that floated pale and indistinct. On a low table lay restraints of iron and leather, polished by use. "The old compact," Eleanor whispered against his ear, her breath cool as grave soil. "Made long before your cities, when the land still bargained. We keep the line pure, feed what watches from the ridges. In return, the hollow protects us. You'll serve well long enough, at least." Maud bound his arms with practiced knots, the rope biting deep, while the voices from the barn swelled into a wretched chorus, as though the captive men sensed another joining their ranks. Elias struggled, kicking over a shelf that shattered jars in a wash of brine and something thicker, but the sisters worked in silent coordination, their movements ritual rather than frantic, drawing him down the steps into the waiting dark where the earth itself seemed to breathe in anticipation. The candle's flame guttered in the draught from the cellar stairs, throwing wild shadows across the jars where pale shapes floated in murky fluid. Elias thrashed against the ropes, the fibers cutting deeper into his wrists with every twist, but Maud's knots held like iron. Eleanor descended slowly, her footsteps soft on the stone, carrying a rusted keyring that jangled with each step. The air down here was colder, damper, laced with the earthy reek of roots pushing through the walls and something metallic, blood-old and new. Elias lunged sideways as Maud loosened her grip to reach for the leg irons, driving his shoulder into her midsection with all the force desperation lent him. She grunted, staggering back against the shelf, and more jars crashed to the floor in a sickening splatter. The candle toppled, extinguishing in the brine, plunging the cellar into utter black broken only by the faint glow leaking from the cabin above. In that darkness Elias rolled, kicking out blindly, his boot connecting with Eleanor's shin. She hissed, a sound more animal than human, and clutched at him, but he twisted free, scrambling up the steps on bound arms and knees, splinters biting into his palms. The cabin door burst open under his shoulder as he barreled through, the impact jarring his bones. Maud's shout echoed behind him, raw with fury, and footsteps pounded in pursuit. Elias stumbled into the night, the mist thicker now, swirling like living smoke around the clearing. The barn loomed ahead, its door still ajar from earlier, and from within came a renewed frenzy, chains clashing, voices rising in a ragged howl as the captives sensed upheaval. He plunged inside, the stench overwhelming, and fumbled in the gloom for the nearest stall. His fingers found a padlock, cold and heavy, and with the revolver still somehow wedged in his belt, miraculously and fired in the struggle, he used the butt to hammer at the hasp. Sparks flew, metal rang, and the lock gave with a snap. The first man spilled out, emaciated legs buckling, but others pressed forward, hands reaching through bars, urging haste in broken whispers. Elias worked frantically, smashing lock after lock, the revolver's grip slick with sweat and blood from his ropes. Men poured into the aisle, some crawling, others supporting the weakest, their eyes wild in the faint moonlight filtering through cracks. 37 shadows merging into a tide of retribution and flight. Behind them, the sisters emerged from the cabin, silhouettes against the lamp's glow, Eleanor's voice rising in that ancient cadence, calling to the woods as if summoning allies older than the hills. Branches cracked in the tree line, wind whipping though no breeze stirred the mist elsewhere. The forest seemed to lean inward, paths closing, undergrowth rustling with unseen movement. The freed men scattered toward the ravine, Elias urging them onward, but cries of confusion rose as trails vanished, footsteps leading in circles. Some turned back toward the clearing, faces twisted in panic, while others vanished into the fog only to re-emerge moments later, disoriented and pleading. The voices that had drawn Elias here now multiplied, echoing from every direction, low murmurs, distant pleas, the sisters' chant weaving through it all like threads in a snare. Chaos swallowed the night, the hollow alive with pursuit and evasion, and Elias ran blindly into the trees, the clamor of chains and cries fading behind him into an endless, unresolved chorus that promised no escape from the watchful dark.